that's why today we wanted to bring an expert on Gen Z behavior. And we found, interestingly enough, a company that's doing this exact thing by surveying over 60,000 people through their phones and getting insights. I want you guys to help me welcome on stage Anish Dhawan, the founder and CEO of Knit, a startup based in Austin that has customers like Moet Hennessy, JBL, sports companies like NASCAR and the San Antonio Spurs, some financial services companies which we cannot disclose on stage, but is really interesting because they're a little bit further ahead in the curve, and other corporate partners of ours like Cargill. So please help me welcome on stage Anish. Please come here. Hey. Great. So welcome, Anish. I think it's a pretty big day. You announced your latest round of funding today. You are our expert on Gen Z online behavior. A lot of interesting things happening right now in the space. But I thought it was an interesting starting point for our audience to perhaps begin with, what is Knit? What do you guys do? And what was the insight to begin this company?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first of all, thanks for having me here. My name is Anish, co-founder, CEO of Knit. I'm a Gen Zer myself as well. And a little bit more about Knit. So like you were saying, we enable some of the world's best and biggest consumer brands to tap into a network of over 1 million Gen Z consumers to gather feedback primarily through the form of video. So these 30 to 90 second long, almost Snapchat selfie style videos. And then our technology analyzes that, pulls out actionable insights. So the reason we started Knit and kind of our unique insight there was that as Gen Zers, we knew that brands had a really tough time engaging this next generation, primarily because, well, 2 reasons. One is our preferences, our attitudes are changing so fast because we're so plugged into the internet. And second, it's just really hard to engage Gen Z in general, especially for like boring kind of survey methodologies, right? Like focus groups or traditional surveys. So we designed a platform where sharing feedback was very much like taking a Snapchat, or posting something on TikTok. These quick 30 to 90 second long videos makes it really engaging for Gen Z, but they're also really excited to share feedback so brands can gather feedback from hundreds of Gen Z consumers through videos over a couple hours instead of like a month to talk to a dozen people over focus groups.
So surveying, obviously, and looking into the data that comes out of those videos, what can you tell us about Gen Zs? What makes them different from other previous generations, like mine? Millennials are getting closer to 40 right now. And what are some of these insights that you're uncovering through your platform?
Yeah, absolutely. So up on the screen, you can see kind of a handy little chart of the age range, right? So I think it starts off by just understanding who Gen Z is today. We are between the ages of 10 and 25. So I'm kind of on the upper portion of Gen Z. Some Gen Zers, the younger portion, were kind of born 2012, around that time. And there's a few defining characteristics when it comes to this next generation. The first thing is we are the most diverse generation out there. Ethnically diverse. If you look at Gen Z, only about 50% of Gen Zers in the United States identify as white. There's about a quarter of us that identify as Hispanic, 15% as Black, the rest Asian and other races. The second thing is Gen Z, we are the first digital native generation. So when I was born, Facebook, MySpace is already out there. The younger Gen Zers were born a year or two before Snapchat. We're spending, like you said, 4+ hours a day on social media. So we're constantly plugged in. And then the last defining characteristic about Gen Z is we are socially conscious. We spend a lot of time thinking about, how can we make an impact in the world around us? And we reward brands that do the same. So something like 80% of Gen Zers in our latest study wanted to support brands that were supporting good causes. 75% of us want to work at brands that put purpose over paychecks, even down to like investing. 75% of us look at our social, review our investments through the lens of social impact. So it kind of seeps into everything we're doing. And the important part, and what I'm sure most of you guys in the audience are thinking today, is we have a lot of spending power now, over $150 billion, and that's growing every single day.
Yeah, it's very impressive. I think, if I'm not mistaken, over the next 8 years or so, Gen Zs are going to increase their spending by 70%. So I want to go back on something that you touched upon, and maybe we'll do a little exercise with the audience. But by show of hands, how many of you have either Snapchat or a TikTok account? All right.
It's actually
All right.
not that bad.
Better than expected. Better than expected. So we talked about how many hours kids are spending on these platforms. And last year alone, something very interesting happened, which is TikTok dethroned Google as the most, or as the number one website on all the internet, which is kind of crazy because they hold that sort of title for the last 15 years. Now, how do brands should be thinking about leveraging TikTok and engaging with Gen Zs through that platform, social media?
Yeah, absolutely. So, before we dive too deep into TikTok, I think it makes sense to talk a little bit about how Gen Z uses social media in general. So, the way Gen Z uses social media is primarily around staying connected with friends. It's also interesting to take a look at how Gen Z is not using social media. We're not using it to share all the details of our life, to create these like highly staged type of content. So that's the biggest difference between my generation and millennials. If you look at Instagram, there's a certain Instagram aesthetic. People are trying to get a certain vibe out there through their Instagram. Gen Z's the polar opposite. It's more authentic. It's more raw, and that's the type of world that TikTok exploded with in Gen Z. Right? It's very raw footage. It's video based, which is more popular with Gen Z as well. So diving into TikTok, you're absolutely right. TikTok has had a great year. YouTube has had a great couple of years as well. Both of these are video-based platforms and have really scaled with Gen Z as their most popular app. So in a recent survey that we ran, which you can see on the screen here, TikTok went from number 3 to number 2, and YouTube went to number 1. And a little bit more about TikTok for this audience. 14% of Gen Zers are using TikTok to follow content on money and finance. So it's a really powerful platform to reach Gen Zers around this idea of financial services or around this topic of financial services.
Let's pause for a second there. And within the realm of financial services, which are, in your opinion, some brands are doing a good job at leveraging, for instance, this platform to engage with their audience?
Yeah, so within financial services, I think some brands that do an incredible job of this is Step. Obviously, they're focused on that younger Gen Zer. They really leverage their influencer partnerships really well. I think they have like a partnership with Charlie D'Amelio, who's obviously really big on TikTok. So yeah, those are some brands that come top of mind. SoFi does.
For the folks that don't know, how many followers does Charlie D'Amelio have on TikTok?
Oof. I don't actually know the exact number, but I think it's over like 5 or 6 million probably.
It's 142 million, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, that sounds about right. Yeah.
I don't have a TikTok account. That's what my analyst told me, just so you guys know. Cool. So you also mentioned being socially conscious, and we've discussed in the past with some of our partners ESG trends and how this is having an impact or a toll on the mental health of Gen Zs. How should brands start thinking about it? Because we hear a lot of ESG. It's been in the news lately. A lot of companies trying to do greenwashing. A lot of funds being on the news because the ESG metrics are somewhat very subject to being manipulated. But it's obviously a big concern, especially the E on ESG. How are Gen Zs thinking about this? What is sort of, or how they're being impacted by all this?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think when it comes to Gen Z, we obviously care a lot about this different social good, social impact, but we also feel very empowered to make these differences. So in a recent study we did, it was about 86% of Gen Zers feel personally responsible to try to solve some of these causes. And talking about within the realm of ESG, some of the biggest kind of things that we're seeing Gen Z care about include mental health, climate crisis, equity, both diversity within different genders and sexualities. So these are some of the biggest things that Gen Z cares about. And what we're seeing is that they care about this a lot. They feel personally empowered, but they also extend that to the brands that they purchase products from, the brands that they work or want to work with, which I know we'll tap into a little bit later today. So about 90% of Gen Zers are more likely to purchase products from brands that care about or support charitable causes that they care about. And about 90% of them are also more likely to work with brands that are caring about and supporting these causes. So that's why you see brands like Patagonia that really kind of walked the talk there as well. They were the number one mentioned brand when it came to brands that were doing well in ESG within Gen Z, at least according to Gen Z. So a lot of that is because of what they're putting out on social, their different impacts and initiatives where they're kind of backing that up with an authentic brand.
And going back to what you mentioned, what should brands avoid then? Because we talked about being disingenuous about how you're portraying yourself on social media, and Gen Z is avoiding that sort of content. That's why they gravitate towards platforms where video is a little less, there's less filters or ways to fake it, I guess.
Yeah, so in terms of like what brands should avoid, I think let's go back to the ESG discussion there. The number one way brands or Gen Z is kind of making that decision of whether a brand is really socially conscious or not is through social media. So it's about 50% plus are doing it through social media or through their website. So what you're putting on social, what you're putting out there on your brand on platforms like social media and your website is very important in how Gen Z is making that decision. Now, within social media, some things that brands should avoid in general and can be related to this topic as well is Gen Z really wants entertaining and educational content. Those are the top two requested things from Gen Z when it comes to what they want to see out of a brand. So that's great for your organic content to promote your brand and services. But also when you want to share some of the great work that your brand is doing, tying that into making sure that the content is entertaining, making sure it's educational. And the last thing is making sure that you're engaging with Gen Z. So if you're a brand out there, don't be afraid to dive into those comment sections and engage with Gen Z in the comments there. That's the third most requested thing they're looking for in their partners on the brands that they're following.
Can we talk a little bit more about the education piece? Because a common request from our partners is financial education. It's a big topic because we saw over the last few years as people were trapped in their houses and started getting their steamy checks and that they increased the amount of spending or investing, but it geared a little bit towards gambling. There's a lot that our partners are willing or want to get more deeper into the education piece. What works and what doesn't?
Yeah, so I sound like a broken record here, but it really does start with social media. 50% of Gen Zers are hearing about or finding or using social media as their number one source. It's the number one influence when it comes to things on financial services. So to your question, I think the best way to educate Gen Z, the best way to get them as customers, the best way to engage them, it kind of all ties back to social media, especially for this industry, is through social media. So creating that kind of educational content on the TikToks, the Instagrams, and the YouTubes of the world. Those are actually the top 3 channels when it comes to finance and financial services. And I think, one thing that brands have the opportunity to do is to really kind of be that guide for Gen Z on these channels. There's a lot of information out there. You can find information on investing, for example, on Reddit, or and sometimes that's great, but a lot of times it can lead to the behaviors that you're talking about. So being kind of that fun and entertaining but responsible voice and trusted voice, there's a huge opportunity for brands to do that within this industry on the social media channels.
Before we go into forecasting what the next few years are going to look like, I want to double click on something that, in my opinion, is very important. And a lot of Gen Z, it's unlike any other generation that's putting a lot of attention to it. It's mental health. And we had a D&I panel here to talk a little bit about diversity in the workplace. And this is going to be the most diverse generation so far. How are Gen Zs thinking about mental health that is also different from the previous generations?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think I might actually have a graph on this as well. So mental health is the number one, yeah, there we go. Mental health is the number one social issue for Gen Z. We focus on Gen Z. We actually also have a millennial audience on our platform. So I don't have data on comparison on Gen Z versus millennials, but for Gen Z, without a doubt, mental health is one of in this case, the most important social issue. I think with Gen Z, one of the driving factors behind this is some of the life events that our generation has gone through. So imagine you're a 17-year-old or 18-year-old or 16-year-old or 20-year-old, kind of in your late teens. over the last 2 years, you've been at home, right? You've missed out on the social aspect of going to school. You might have missed your graduation for college or high school. And I think a lot of this came out of the pandemic, where you see this bigger focus on mental health. And I would say that's probably the biggest driving factor and the biggest defining characteristic between Gen Z and millennials. Not that it hasn't impacted millennials, but it's just such a unique life stage that Gen Z has been in during the pandemic, during social distancing. And that's why you see coming out of the pandemic this increasing focus, at least for Gen Z, or emphasis for Gen Z on mental health.
Thank you. Obviously, my generation started entering the workforce in the middle of a financial crisis. We are sort of in a similar situation, as I think most in this audience would agree, that we're heading towards a recession. Highest inflation in the last 41 years. How are Gen Zs thinking about this, and do you think it's going to have a lingering impact in that generation as they're entering the workforce?
Yeah, absolutely. So when we look at the outlook, financial kind of trends that are coming out of Gen Z, I think one of the defining characteristics for Gen Z is what is going on in the pandemic and what's happening right now. And also, if you take a step back, even the '08 financial crisis, right? I think I was probably 10, 11, 12 at that time. And a lot of Gen Zers still remember, maybe their parents lost their job, maybe they lost their home. And then fast forward to the pandemic, a lot of their offers got rescinded or they, got fired or laid off. And who knows what's going to happen over these next couple months. So we're already starting to see some trends. It's still too early to call, right? I mean, there's the adult Gen Z population is only 18 to 24, but some things that we're seeing that might impact how they interact and how they might, interact with financial services, especially, is one, we're seeing that Gen Z's a lot less. They have a lot less affinity towards credit, right? So when you look at an adult Gen Zer, on average, they have about a 1.5 credit cards compared to the average U.S. consumer, at least as 6 months ago, was about 4. If you look at things like buy now, pay later, they're flocking towards that. I think a firm released a report saying that they saw a 200% increase in their buy now, pay later product with Gen Z over the pandemic. So that's one of the trends that we're seeing, is that they're thinking differently about things like credit. They're prioritizing things like savings. And I think a lot of that has to do in the world that we've grown up in and are currently experiencing.
I want to go back to some of the slides that you showcased, because I thought it was really interesting, and maybe touch upon again on the brands. What brands were I saw some real interesting slides, but I don't, because we're going in the different directions. The conversation is steering in a very interesting way, but this is a very interesting slide, because I see Nike, our partner there. TikTok is the platform itself, which is interesting to me, because I don't think my generation perceives Facebook as one of the leading brands with the most or the best organic content. But these guys are doing something very interesting.
Yeah, so going back to what Gen Z wants on social media, right? They want entertaining, entertaining and or educational content, and they want brands that really interact with them, that engage with them. And from our survey, these were a couple of the most mentioned brands. Nike and Red Bull. If you've ever gone to Red Bull's TikTok, it's awesome, very entertaining, and Duolingo is very entertaining, somewhat educational as well. Even TikTok has really entertaining content. I think one of the biggest takeaways and biggest opportunities on a platform specific, specifically TikTok, like you mentioned, and kind of how we started this conversation off, is within TikTok, Gen Z finds it to be the platform where they can get the best organic branded content. So what that means is that they really love TikTok as a way to follow brands they love because of the content they're organically creating, not paid content that they're running through paid ads, but organic content. So for TikTok specifically, which is where this data is coming from as well, you have a huge opportunity, and these are some of the brands doing the best job of it outside of this industry, and can be a really kind of good North Star in terms of how to create that entertaining and educational content and how to really engage with your community.
Perfect. Let's do a little forecasting here. What are your thoughts on this demographic for 2022 and beyond? And maybe spend some time with other big issues or themes across Gen Zs that will shape this generation over the coming years. We talked about the financial crisis that might or might not happen, hopefully not. But there's obviously some other big tailwinds here.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think there's three major defining characteristics when it comes to how the lens that we view these trends at, and then I'll dive into some of these trends or some of these outlooks or forecasts. The first defining characteristic is the world we've grown up in, which we've already touched on. The '08 pandemic, whatever might be happening right now, that'll be really interesting to track for some of our partners in this space. The second is the fact that Gen Z are digital natives. So 95% of us are using mobile banking. And we'll dive into some of these trends as well. It's just fascinating, but we want a one-stop shop for all of our different financial services. So you'll see this, and I mean, we're already seeing it, like a digitization of financial services. And then the second is social media. I think I already mentioned 50% are using that as their kind of source of truth for learning about different financial services. So kind of understanding these driving forces, some of the things that our team is predicting and kind of tracking for some of our customers is the first one is this move towards a super app. Again, 95% of us are using mobile banking. Over the majority of us, 70% plus, want that one-stop shop. So they're looking at banks, they're looking at technology companies. There's a lot of potential players in this space. Some are already doing a really good job of this. And it's not just, hey, we want a place for banking, but we actually want this bank or tech company, whatever we're using for that banking, to provide us with all of our services, P2P payments, investing services, financial advising. So that's a really unique opportunity to look at and think about how can your brand play in that? Can we partner with one of these brands that is becoming that one-stop shop? Can we actually become that one-stop shop? I think that's pretty hard to do, but there's some brands doing a really good job of that. The second major trend or thing that we're seeing is the shift towards being a social media, maybe not a social media first company, but a company that really embraces social media. So from our research, and I think we shared a stat here already, 14% of Gen Zers are already using TikTok to follow finance and money trends. The other two major platforms to keep an eye out are YouTube and Instagram. And so the fact that almost the majority of Gen Zers are using social media as their source of truth means that you really have to embrace it. Like, you have to use it for customer acquisition, engagement, retention. It really has to be at the center of your strategy when it comes to this younger generation. And you're seeing, again, brands that are focused on this next generation, like Step, do an incredible job of that. And then the last thing here is the talent wars, right? I don't think we've talked about this too much, but it's really fascinating to see as Gen Z gets older and brands start recruiting Gen Z, how difficult it can be to actually attract Gen Z. So again, purpose is greater than paycheck for the majority of Gen Zers. And I do want to make a note here because we get this stereotype all the time, like just because Gen Z is idealistic doesn't mean they're not willing to work really hard and be really good employees and be driven by that. So you also see some great stats here, like 60% of them are willing to work late nights and weekends. We want to be entrepreneurs as well. So I think the other trend you'll see is this push to become more socially conscious to attract some of the best Gen Zers so that they have that purpose as well as the paycheck.
There's two things I want to touch upon. Maybe we could go back to the super app slide, because a lot of insurance companies in the audience keep asking us, well, we're not a bank. What do we do here? How do we sell insurance? And this is important because Gen Zs are coming to market, meaning that they're going to start purchasing cars, renting apartments, buying homes, and eventually growing their own families. How should insurance companies think about dealing with this super fintech apps?
So I'm not an insurance expert, or frankly, for that matter, like a financial services expert. I feel like, or I know I have a really good understanding of Gen Z, and so does our company. But if we look at some of the data we've seen and how we're helping some of our partners think through this, I think table stakes is to digitize your offering, right? Like, when I graduated college and moved into my first apartment, the first insurance company I went to was Lemonade, right? They made it super easy to find home insurance and kind of expand from there. So I think table stakes is to become, digitize your brand, digitize your platform, and then from there, once you build that brand equity with Gen Z, really build that kind of brand that they love, expanding from there. In terms of becoming that one-stop shop, that I don't know how feasible it is for some brands to kind of expand their services, but I do think there's a lot of opportunities out there for partnerships. Like a great example of that is like Bank of America and all these banks that came up with their P2P payment, like Zelle. Like that was a great example, and now I think it's the most used P2P payments app.
I think embedded insurance was the number 3 category on the list of hot topics for our anchor partners. But one of the other lingering things that people usually discuss, and we touched upon this, attracting Gen Zs is difficult enough. Retaining them is even harder. How should companies in this auditorium think about Gen Zs in the workforce? And more importantly, how can they keep that talent within those companies?
Yeah, absolutely. So again, one of the biggest things is purpose over paycheck, right? Are you creating a company where there is purpose over paycheck? And I think that comes in a couple different ways. One is the work that your company is doing. Is it having a social impact on the world around it? The second is, are they having an impact through their work? So as a Gen Z, or myself, but also as a Gen Z employee or employer of other Gen Zers and other generations, one of the things we think about a lot is, are we creating a company where people see the change that they're implementing in the company? And it's pretty easy to do as a startup. It's a lot harder to do when you're a bigger company. And I think that's the other thing that Gen Z really looks for is like, what is the impact of my work? And can I get that kind of feedback cycle on it?
What about remote work? Do they want to come to the office?
So this is I'm torn on this a little bit. So I think I'm a bit biased too, because I personally love going into the office, and that's the culture that we're creating. We have a hybrid culture, but so we're a little lenient on it. I think there's aspects of it that Gen Z from the work we're doing really misses. That's the social connection piece. And for training and stuff, like it is difficult sometimes to get that in a virtual environment than you would if you just had those kind of one-off conversations in the workplace as you're going to get coffee or something. The place where I think, in my personal opinion, is hybrid is going to be kind of the way that Gen Z wants to interact, because they are more comfortable, I would say, than the general population with kind of asynchronous work or video work kind of in that more digital environment. Because again, most of us when we were going to college, it was all over Zoom. When we were talking to our friends over the pandemic, it was mostly through video apps. So I think there's a little bit of a more comfortability with that, but I do think for certain things they're going to actually want to be in person, especially this early on in their career.
Perfect. We're almost out of time. So Anish, any advice for the audience or corporates and startups even in this audience that you would give them about how they're thinking about Gen Zs? Anything that we might have missed before we wrap up?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think when it comes to Gen Z, some of the most important things to remember are digital first generation. So they're spending so much time on their phone, they want to interact with the brands and products on their phone. And they're all on social media. They're always plugged in. So the reason that becomes important is a couple different ways. One is making sure your product is really easy to use and available on your phone. The second is also they're changing. Like our attitudes, our behaviors, our kind of perceptions are changing at the speed of the internet. The second is that Gen Z is very diverse. We talked about Gen Z very much in broad strokes today, but it is the most diverse generation alive today. So really focusing and being mindful that there are pretty large communities within Gen Z that are very different from each other. And then lastly is this social impact. And again, it doesn't necessarily mean just, hey, they want to do really good in the world, which they do, but also like they want to see the impact of their work in the world. So the best way to engage Gen Z is to understand them, and just keeping those principles in mind as you're trying to understand them, I think is very important.
Perfect. All right, folks, we're out of time, and I know that we are standing in the way between lunch. So please help me say thank you to Anish. Thank you for being here. And it's a pleasure.